Hi, Jim Benson here from Modus Cooperandi and Personal Kanban. Here to talk a little bit about outsourcing and what you need in order to outsource. And as a tool for this today, I'm using the Cynefin model, Dave Snowden's Cynefin model. And when you look at the Cynefin model here, it's tempting to think of it like it is a set of quadrants, because it kind of looks like a set of quadrants. But what we really have here is, if you imagine kind of a dial being in the middle of this thing, and the dial itself is allowing you to turn this arc here, and it's an arrow, you can kind of turn that dial from chaotic back to simple. And what we'd like to do when we're working with teams is respect the fact that sometimes things are on this complex and chaotic side, and sometimes they're on the complicated or simple side. And for simple, we can actually apply best practices. It's something where we know if we put in an ounce of energy, we will get out a certain amount of product. And this is repeatable. It's a process where we've set up best practices that say, if you do this, this will be the outcome. So complicated is a little less sure about that. You know that if you do some things, you will have some outputs that more or less conform to the outputs before it. And there you want to apply good practices, and good practices have a lot more leeway. And when we move over into complex and chaotic, we end up in the unordered side of this matrix. And the unordered side of this matrix, chaotic, is we simply don't know what's happening yet. We assume that there is practices that we can adopt, or there are practices that we can adopt that will allow us to do things, but we don't know for sure what those are. So we work on them, and as we start to work on them and some of them become more and more right, we're moving backwards around this arc in an ultimate goal to get to things that we can manage. So complex is the domain that is where we tend to, as knowledge workers, spend a lot of our time. We do inventive processes where we're going into areas where we have a general idea of what's going to happen, but the demands on our time and the amount of interruptions and all of the things that are coming up keep us in an environment where we're not able to control our inputs or our outputs very well. So one of the issues with outsourcing software as opposed to hardware is, with hardware, you're down here in this simple domain, and that simple domain is extremely tight. You can write a spec, you can send it to somewhere, and the only thing you have to worry about was, did they do the spec correctly? And it's very easy to check on that. As we end up here in the complex and complicated domains, it's a lot harder for us to figure out exactly what it was that was asked for. So when somebody comes to you and says, I want you to write a report about this, there's a lot of ways that you can write that report, versus if someone comes to you and says, I want you to make a door handle for a 1972 Pinto. Well, there's only one 1972 Pinto door handle that you can make. So that is a simple object versus the complicated objects that we're shooting for there. So when we're outsourcing for software, we end up in this situation here, in this complex, complicated situation, where we don't know exactly what needs to be built or how it can be built. And the more that we don't know that, the more, again, that we are moving backwards through this process, the more we're moving in this direction. And we don't want to move in that direction. So we want to have a lot of very rich conversations about what's going on. As you move towards the chaotic domain, you need a much higher level of constant verbal and human interaction in order to solve the problems that are arising in that particular production mechanism. So when we are outsourcing things, or when we are working with highly distributed teams, we want to stick to this ordered side. We want to stick to this section over here. We want to be able to clearly tell people what they need to do and have them do it without a lot of guidance. But the more that we're moving in this direction, the more guidance people need, the more conversations people need to have, not only to get the right thing done, but to make sure that everybody knows what's going on. Because also, the amount of information that's needed to manage anything over here is crazy higher than it is over here. So that's why when we outsource software projects in particular, we tend to run into problems because we tell people to do things and we think we're operating in this domain, but we're not. So we think, because we envision what the framework is, what the scope of work is that people are going to have while they're working on these tasks, we think that because we've envisioned it, that they're going to envision the same thing. But there's a lot more leeway that they can use. And when they exercise that leeway, when people exercise that leeway, which is why we hire them, which is why they're professionals, they stand a much greater chance of doing something other than what we expected. And the more moving parts we have in any project, the more that people have to operate within certain expectations and certain tolerances because they have to plug their part into somebody else's part. So I have seen teams use outsourcing and have highly distributed teams and build extremely complex things. They've operated very much in the complex domain the entire time, and everything has gone very well. But that's because they understand that they need constant communication. And if it's outsourcing to another country with a team that your team in your home country hasn't met before, you need to have some face-to-face time with that team. You need to build some rapport, because there's a lot of that rapport that drives these complex conversations. Without that rapport, you operate on a lot of assumptions. So that's a short bit on outsourcing and the Cynefin model. It's always nice to doodle on a screen. And I'd appreciate any comments, and we can continue the conversation. So this is Jim Benson from Modus Cooperandi and Personal Kanban saying thanks.